The rhythmic buzz of clippers hummed through the warm, inviting atmosphere of the barbershop, punctuated by bursts of laughter and friendly debates. Sunlight poured through the wide glass windows, illuminating the polished black and white tiles. The shop was alive with chatter, a mix of sports talk, neighborhood gossip, and occasional jokes. Darius sat quietly in his favorite chair by the corner, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His broad shoulders and relaxed demeanor made him appear calm, almost unbothered, as he chuckled at the conversation happening around him. Ali would have danced circles around Tyson, Jerome the barber argued animatedly as his clippers worked on a customer's clean fade. Darius grinned faintly, his deep voice rumbling with authority. Ali had skill no doubt, but Tyson had that knockout power. One wrong move, and it's lights out. The shop was more than a place to get a haircut. It was a cornerstone of the community, a sanctuary where men laughed, debated, and shared stories. But the peaceful camaraderie was about to take a sudden, unwelcome turn. The bell above the door jingled, and the air shifted instantly. 3 men swaggered into the shop, their presence heavy with menace. At the front was a wiry man with pale skin and a sharp jawline. His name was Ethan, and he oozed arrogance with every step. Flanking him were Jake and Brandon, one sneering, the other quieter but uneasy. Their smug expressions were enough to sour the room's atmosphere. "Afternoon, fellas," Ethan drawled, leaning casually against the counter. His mocking tone immediately set everyone on edge. His piercing gaze swept the shop before landing on Darius. "Nice place you've got here. Be a shame if something happened to it." Jerome stiffened slightly, his hands still steady on the clippers. "We don't want any trouble, Ethan. Just let us do our thing." Ethan grinned, pulling a toothpick from his pocket and wedging it between his teeth. "Oh, there won't be trouble, long as everyone plays along. Small fee, you know, for keeping this place protected." His eyes flicked back to Darius, who was quietly observing the scene. "Especially with a big guy like you around. You probably need some extra security, huh?" Jake snickered, his gaze full of disdain as it raked over Darius. "What's this, a retired heavyweight champ? Or just heavy?" The laugh that followed was cruel and pointed, but Darius didn't react. He set his coffee cup down slowly, his expression unreadable. The shop grew quieter save for the faint hum of the clippers as the tension thickened like an approaching storm. "What's the matter, big guy?" Ethan taunted, taking a step closer. "Too slow to keep up, or just too tired to try?" Darius met Ethan's gaze, his calm composure unshaken. "I'm about respect," he replied evenly, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "Something you seem to be running low on." Ethan's smirk faltered slightly, but only for a moment. "Respect? That's earned, friend," he said, stepping closer. His faux friendliness melted away, replaced by open hostility. Jake leaned casually on the counter, running his fingers over the clippers and tools laid out before him. "Nice setup you got here," he said, grinning maliciously. "Would be a real shame if something happened to it, huh?" Ethan pulled a crumpled flyer from his jacket, slapping it onto the counter in front of Jerome. "Neighborhood's been getting rough lately. A place like this could use some insurance. My boys and I were all about keeping the peace." Jerome glanced at the flyer without picking it up. It was a cheap advertisement for a so-called security service, complete with a phone number and a shoddy logo. Jerome's jaw tightened. He didn't need to read it to know what it was. A scam, plain and simple. "We're good here," he said carefully, his tone even. "Always have been." "Oh, I don't doubt it," Ethan said, chuckling darkly. "But you know, things happen. A broken window here, some graffiti there. It's unpredictable these days. Wouldn't you feel better knowing someone's watching out for you?" The room was quiet now, save for the faint hum of the clippers. Darius observed everything, his sharp eyes tracking every movement. He saw the unease in Brandon's face, the sneer on Jake's lips, and the way Ethan was pushing closer, trying to provoke him. "You're a quiet one, huh?" Ethan said, turning his full attention to Darius. He tilted his head, sizing him up. "Big guy like you? I bet you're all about keeping the peace, too." Darius picked up his coffee cup again, taking a slow sip before setting it down with deliberate care. His calm gaze locked onto Ethan's. "I am," he said, "but only when it's mutual." The room crackled with tension. Ethan's smirk widened, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "Let's see how mutual it is, then." After. The challenge was clear, and the storm was about to break. The barber shop was heavy with tension, the kind that pressed down on everyone in the room. Conversations had ceased, and the once lively space felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Jerome placed his clippers on the counter carefully, his hands trembling as he took a cautious step forward. "That's enough, Ethan," Jerome said, his voice trembling slightly. "We don't need whatever it is you're selling." But Ethan didn't so much as glance in Jerome's direction. His focus was locked on Darius, his sneering grin fading into something colder and far more menacing. "So, what's it gonna be, big guy?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "You gonna play nice, or do we need to work a little harder to get our point across?" Darius set his coffee cup down on the table beside him, the motion slow and deliberate. His calm, unshaken demeanor was at odds with the electricity crackling in the air around him. "I think you've overstayed your welcome," he said, his deep voice steady and even. Ethan's jaw tightened, his smug grin faltering as irritation flashed across his face. The thin veneer of friendliness he'd been wearing cracked, and the barbershop seemed to hold its collective breath. The gang's false bravado collided with Darius's unyielding calm, and everyone knew that the moment of reckoning was inevitable. Ethan laughed loudly, the sound hollow and exaggerated, as if Darius's words were the most absurd thing he'd ever heard. He took a step back, gesturing to Jake and Brandon with a careless wave. "Hear that, boys? Big guy here thinks he's running the show." Jake snorted, leaning against the wall as he folded his arms across his chest. "Yeah, maybe he thinks he's gonna throw his weight around," he said with a sneer. "He's got plenty to spare." Brandon chuckled nervously, his laughter uneasy and forced as he darted a glance at Darius. He wasn't as quick to join in, and Ethan noticed, shooting him a sharp glare before turning his attention back to Darius. "You know," Ethan said, his voice adopting a cruel, mocking tone, "I've always wondered how people like you let yourselves go like that, but I guess when you're used to being last in line it doesn't really matter, does it?" The insult cut through the room like a knife. Jerome shifted uncomfortably behind the counter, and a few patrons exchanged uneasy glances, but Darius didn't flinch. His sharp gaze remained fixed on Ethan, his silence speaking louder than any words could. Jake, emboldened by Ethan's taunts, stepped forward, his smirk growing wider. "Maybe he figures if he's big enough no one'll bother messing with him," he said, gesturing toward Darius. "Worked so far, right?" Ethan chuckled, his tone dripping with venomous mockery. "Yeah, must be rough, big guy. Always being the one people look at funny, always being the one people cross the street to avoid, and always being the one who knows deep down you're not really welcome." The barbershop seemed to hold its breath, as Ethan's words lingered in the air. Jerome opened his mouth, ready to interject, but Darius raised a hand, stopping him. His deep voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let me make this real clear for you," Darius said. "You don't own this place, and you're not going to intimidate anyone here. Take your nonsense somewhere else." Ethan's grin faltered again, but his bravado returned quickly. "Oh, is that how it is? Big guy thinks he's going to tell me what to do?" He leaned in closer, his tone turning dark. "Man, look at you, all big and bad. What are you going to do, sit on us?" The gang erupted into laughter, the cruel sound echoing off the walls, but Brandon's laugh was quieter, more strained, as he shuffled his feet uneasily. Darius's sharp gaze didn't waver. His massive frame remained still, his calm and unspoken challenge. "You've got one chance to walk out of here," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Don't make me repeat myself." The laughter faded as Ethan's eyes narrowed. The false humor and mocking grin were gone, replaced with simmering rage. "You think you scare me, big man," he snarled. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said firmly. "This is about you." For a moment, the only sound in the shop was the faint buzz of the clippers Jerome had forgotten to turn off. The tension was suffocating, every eye in the room locked on Darius and Ethan. The gang's bravado was starting to crack, but Ethan wasn't ready to back down. "You know what your problem is?" Ethan sneered, stepping closer. "People like you always think you can walk around acting better than us, but we all know the truth. You're just a fat, useless—" The words barely left Ethan's mouth before Darius moved. In one fluid motion, Darius's massive hand shot forward, grabbing Ethan by the collar. The smaller man barely had time to gasp before Darius yanked him off balance, his feet skidding across the polished floor. The room erupted into gasps, the sudden burst of energy silencing even the faint buzz of the clippers. Before Ethan could react, Darius's fist connected with his jaw in a single devastating punch. The sound of the impact was sharp and brutal, reverberating through the shop. Ethan crumpled to the floor, groaning as he clutched his face. The barber shop fell silent, the charged air crackling with tension as Darius stood motionless in the center of the room. Ethan's crumpled figure against the barber chair was a stark reminder of the power that had just been unleashed, but it wasn't over yet. Ethan struggled to his feet, clutching his bruised jaw, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You're dead for this," he spat, his voice hoarse and shaking with rage. Darius's steady gaze locked onto him, unshaken. His voice was calm but carried a weight that silenced the room. "Come, try me." Jake, still sprawled on the floor, groaned as he reached for a stool nearby. With a guttural growl, he swung it wildly at Darius's head. The stool sliced through the air, but Darius moved with precision, ducking effortlessly. Before Jake could recover, Darius countered with a punishing uppercut to his chin. The stool flew from Jake's grasp as his body crumpled to the floor, hitting the tiles with a heavy thud. The shop descended into chaos. Chairs toppled, clippers clattered to the floor, and patrons scrambled to get out of the way. Jerome pressed himself against the counter, his eyes wide in shock as the scene unfolded. Ethan screamed in frustration, charging at Darius with wild fists. His movements were fueled by rage but lacked any precision or skill. Darius calmly blocked the first punch with his forearm, countering with a sharp jab to Ethan's nose. Blood sprayed instantly, and Ethan staggered back, clutching his face as he howled in pain. Darius didn't let up. He moved forward with deliberate steps, cutting off Ethan's escape. Another jab struck Ethan's gut, forcing him to double over. Before Ethan could recover, Darius unleashed a crushing left hook to his temple, sending him sprawling to the floor once more. Brandon, who had been hovering near the wall, paled as he watched his friends fall one by one. His fists were clenched, but he made no move to intervene. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape route, his loyalty visibly crumbling under the pressure. Jake managed to pull himself to his feet, leaning heavily on the counter for support. His breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling as he tried to steady himself. You're gonna pay for this," he wheezed, wiping blood from the corner of his mouth. Darius turned his head slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he fixed Jake with an icy stare. "You don't know what paying is yet," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. Jake's bravado faltered. He grabbed a broomstick from the corner, gripping it tightly as he held it out like a weapon. Letting out a desperate yell, he charged at Darius, swinging it wildly. Darius caught the broomstick mid-swing, his grip like iron. With a single motion, he yanked it from Jake's hands and snapped it over his knee. The sharp crack of splintering wood echoed through the shop, silencing everyone. Jake stumbled backward, raising his hands in a futile attempt to shield himself. Darius stepped forward and delivered a devastating right cross to Jake's jaw, sending him spinning into a stack of chairs. He hit the floor hard, groaning in pain and unable to move. Ethan crawled to his knees, his face smeared with blood and sweat. His confidence was shattered, but the hatred in his eyes still burned. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice trembling. "You're a dead man." Darius loomed over him, his shadow casting a dark silhouette across Ethan's broken figure. His voice was calm but commanding, filled with finality. "No," he said. "It's over when I say it's over." Ethan tried to scramble to his feet, but Darius landed one last blow, a brutal punch to his stomach. Ethan collapsed again, coughing and clutching his midsection as he gasped for air. The barber shop was eerily quiet now, the only sounds the ragged breathing of the gang members and the faint creak of the door as Brandon slipped out unnoticed. Darius stood tall in the center of the room, his broad chest rising and falling steadily. His face was calm, but his clenched fists told a different story. "You want to mess with me?" Darius said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Then you're going to learn what real respect means." The barbershop door swung open with a violent crash as Ethan staggered out, clutching his ribs. His face was twisted in pain and fury as he stumbled onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the scene. Jake limped behind him, holding his jaw, while Brandon lingered by the door, uncertain and pale. Inside, the barbershop began to stir. Chairs were righted, clippers picked up, and Jerome finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging as the tension drained from the room. Darius looked around, his gaze softening as he turned to the others. "It's over now," he said quietly, his voice carrying a reassurance that settled over the shop like a calming wave. The barbershop door swung shut behind Darius, cutting off the noise from the dispersing crowd outside. Inside, the air was heavy, the tension from the confrontation lingering like a storm that had just passed. Darius moved with a deliberate calm, his imposing frame taking up the space as if to reclaim it from the chaos that had briefly threatened to consume it. His knuckles were red, raw from the fight, but his expression remained composed, his deep breaths measured and steady. Jerome stood behind the counter, his hands still trembling as he clutched the edge of the counter for support. His face was a mix of disbelief and relief, his eyes locked on Darius as though trying to process what had just unfolded. The other patrons sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide, their conversations cut short by the spectacle they had just witnessed. Darius walked over to his chair near the corner, the same one he had been sitting in before the gang had stormed in and shattered the peace. He picked up his coffee, now lukewarm, and took a long sip. The simple act of drinking seemed almost surreal against the backdrop of what had just occurred. Jerome broke the silence first, his voice shaky and incredulous. "Man! What the hell just happened?" Darius set his coffee down and looked at him, his gaze softening. "Just some punks who thought they owned the place," he said evenly, as if explaining something mundane. Jerome shook his head, running a hand over his face. "Punks? Darius, you just wiped the floor with them like it was nothing. Ethan pulled a knife on you, man." Darius shrugged, his massive shoulders rising and falling. "They pushed their luck, that's all there is to it." One of the patrons, an older man who had been sitting near the window, finally spoke up, his voice filled with awe. "I've never seen anything like that. You moved like you were in a boxing match or something." Darius glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Something like that." Another voice chimed in, a younger man sitting near the back. "Man, you could have walked away, but you didn't. Why?" Darius's gaze turned thoughtful for a moment. He leaned back in his chair, his deep voice steady as he answered, "Because some people need to learn that bullying doesn't get them anywhere. They thought they could walk in here, scare you all and get what they wanted. Somebody had to stand up to them." The room fell silent again, but this time, the tension had eased. The fear that had gripped the patrons earlier was now replaced with a growing sense of admiration. Jerome let out a low chuckle, though his hands were still shaking slightly. "Well, you sure showed them. I don't think they'll be coming back anytime soon." Darius nodded. "They won't. And if they do, they'll regret it." Outside, the remnants of the fight were still visible. Ethan sat slumped on the curb, holding his injured wrist and glaring at the ground, his earlier bravado completely shattered. Jake lay sprawled on the pavement, groaning as he clutched his jaw. The once confident gang members had been reduced to humiliated shadows of themselves. Their reign of intimidation over the neighborhood dealt a crippling blow. Inside, the barbershop began to come alive again. Chairs were righted, clippers retrieved from the floor, and slowly, conversations resumed. But this time there was an energy in the air, a shared understanding that something had shifted. The shop had been tested, and it had stood its ground thanks to the quiet strength of the man now sipping his coffee as though nothing had happened. Jerome walked over to Darius, a hesitant but grateful smile on his face. "Thanks, man, for standing up for us." Darius looked up at him, his calm expression unwavering. "You don't need to thank me, Jerome. This place, it's more than just a shop, it's part of the community. People like them don't get to take that away." Jerome nodded, the weight of Darius's words sinking in. "Well, you're welcome here anytime. Not just for the cuts, but, in case we ever need a little backup." Darius chuckled softly, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." As the barbershop returned to its usual rhythm, the faint buzz of clippers filling the air once more, Darius leaned back in his chair, his broad frame relaxed but alert. The fight was over, but the lesson had been delivered. Respect wasn't something that could be demanded or taken, it had to be earned. And today, Darius had shown everyone in that shop, and on that street, exactly what that meant. The officer scribbled something in his notepad, his expression unreadable. He glanced at his partner who was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, still wearing an air of disinterest. The younger officer finally spoke, his tone laced with skepticism. "So you're telling us 3 guys decided to pick a fight and you just happened to take them all down on your own?" Jerome folded his arms, stepping forward. "You weren't here, officer. If you had been, you'd have seen they were the ones causing trouble. Darius was just protecting the shop and everyone in it." The older officer held up a hand, signaling Jerome to calm down. "Look, We're not here to take sides. We just need to know if this is going to escalate. These guys you fought, Ethan and his crew, they're known to us. They've got a reputation for coming back harder when they take a loss. So, are we going to be back here tomorrow dealing with something worse? Darius met the officer's gaze, his voice steady but firm. If they come back, it'll be their mistake. I'm not looking for trouble, but I won't let them push people around either. The officers studied Darius for a long moment before nodding slowly. All right, but if they come back, you call us first. Don't take matters into your own hands again. You understand? Darius gave a curt nod. Understood. The officer closed his notepad, tucking it into his pocket. We'll patrol the area tonight, just in case, but don't expect us to be everywhere at once. As the two officers left, Jerome let out a long breath. Great, they're going to do a couple of drive-bys and call it a day. You know they won't actually stop Ethan if he tries something. Darius leaned back in his chair, his gaze returning to the street outside. I'm not counting on them. The barber shop fell into a heavy silence again, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. One of the lingering patrons, an older man with a weathered face, spoke up from his seat. You did the right thing, Darius. Those boys have been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. Someone had to stand up to them. Darius nodded slightly but didn't respond. He wasn't looking for praise. His focus was on what would come next. He knew men like Ethan wouldn't just walk away from a loss. They would come back, angrier, more desperate, and more dangerous. Hours later, as the last of the patrons left and Jerome locked up for the night, Darius stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the streetlights. Jerome walked over, his hands in his pockets. You sure you're good, man? Jerome asked, his voice quieter now that the shop was empty. Darius glanced at him, his expression unreadable. I'm good. You just keep this place running. Don't let them scare you. Jerome hesitated before nodding. All right, but you watch your back. This ain't over. Darius didn't reply. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cool night air washing over him as he looked down the empty street. He could still feel the tension in his muscles, the adrenaline from earlier lingering just beneath the surface. Brandon's face flashed in his mind, the hesitation in the young man's eyes as he chose to walk away. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for someone like him to break free from the cycle of violence. But for Ethan and Jake, Darius knew the fight wasn't over. They'd be back. And when they came, they wouldn't come alone. As Darius walked away from the shop, his broad frame blending into the shadows of the night, he knew one thing for sure. He'd be ready. Whatever was coming, he wouldn't back down. Not for himself, and not for the community that needed someone to stand up for them. And if Ethan wanted to test him again, well, he'd learn the hard way, just like before. Darius took a deep breath, his fingers brushing over the edges of the note in his pocket as his mind raced. This wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Ethan and his crew were making their move, and Darius knew he had to be ready. They're testing us, Darius said finally, his voice steady but low. Seeing if we'll fold under pressure. Jerome leaned against the counter, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. And what if they don't stop at testing us? What if next time they bring more guys, more weapons? Darius looked at Jerome, his jaw tightening. Then I'll handle it, but I won't let them scare us into running. This is our neighborhood, not theirs. Jerome shook his head, his expression conflicted. You're one man, Darius. You can't take on an entire gang. Darius's lips curled into a faint, grim smile. You'd be surprised what one man can do when he's got nothing left to lose. The words hung heavy in the air. Jerome stared at him for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. All right, just be careful, man. Darius gave a small nod, then turned toward the door. Keep the shop locked up tight, Jerome. I'll be back later to check in. As he stepped outside, the late morning sun felt brighter than it should have. Darius glanced down both ends of the street, his sharp eyes scanning for anything unusual. A few neighbors waved at him, their smiles genuine, but unaware of the growing storm that loomed over their community. He waved back, his mind already planning his next move. That evening, Darius found himself back in his gym, the familiar smell of sweat and leather filling the air. The rhythmic sound of his fists pounding into a heavy bag echoed in the empty space. Each strike was deliberate, his focus razor-sharp. This was more than just training, it was preparation. He thought about the note, about Ethan and his crew. They were desperate now, their humiliation fueling their need for revenge. Desperation made people reckless, and reckless people made mistakes. If they came for him again, he'd be ready. As the hours passed and the streetlights outside flickered on, Darius heard the faint creak of the gym door. He turned, his hands still wrapped in tape, to see Brandon standing hesitantly in the doorway. "You're a hard man to find," Brandon said, his voice quiet but tense. Darius raised an eyebrow, stepping away from the bag. "What do you want, Brandon?" Brandon glanced over his shoulder nervously before stepping further inside. "Look, I know you're not going to trust me, but I had to come talk to you." Darius crossed his arms, his broad frame imposing even in the dim light. "You've got about 30 seconds to convince me not to throw you out." Brandon nodded quickly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Okay, look, Ethan's planning something big. He's been talking to people outside the neighborhood, calling in favors. He's not just looking to come after you, he wants to make a statement." Darius's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. "What kind of statement?" Brandon swallowed hard. "He's talking about hitting the barbershop again, maybe even the gym. He wants to make it clear that no one messes with him and walks away." Darius studied Brandon carefully, searching for any sign of deceit. Finally he spoke. "Why are you telling me this? You're one of them." Brandon shook his head quickly. "Not anymore. After what you did to Ethan and Jake, I realized they're not worth following. They don't care about anyone but themselves. And I don't want to go down with them when this blows up." For a long moment the two men stood in silence, the tension thick. Finally, Darius nodded. "All right, thanks for the heads up. Now get out of here." Brandon hesitated, then turned and left without another word. Later that night, Darius sat alone in his small apartment, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. His hands rested on the table, the note from the barbershop and Brandon's warning replaying in his mind. This wasn't just about defending himself anymore, this was about protecting the people who couldn't fight back, about standing up for a community that had been pushed around for too long. As he stared at the note, Darius's resolve solidified. Ethan wanted a fight, he'd get one. But it wouldn't be on Ethan's terms, it would be on Darius's. The plan was beginning to take shape, and Darius felt a sense of clarity as he leaned back in his chair. He and Jack went over the details, fine-tuning the setup. The barbershop would serve as the battleground, but it wouldn't just be about brute force. This was about sending a message, one that Ethan and his crew couldn't ignore, and the neighborhood wouldn't forget. The next day, word spread quietly through the neighborhood that Darius would be at the barbershop late that evening. It wasn't overt, but it was deliberate. Jerome let it slip to a customer here, a passerby there. The kind of news that would eventually find its way to Ethan. Darius knew Ethan's pride would do the rest. By nightfall, the shop was empty, except for Darius and Jerome. The chairs had been pushed to the side, and the usual hum of conversation was replaced by a tense silence. Outside, the streetlights flickered as the quiet neighborhood settled into the evening. Darius sat near the window, his massive frame relaxed, but his eyes sharp. His phone buzzed with a message from Jack. "We're in position, got eyes on the street, just say the word." Darius replied with a quick, "Stand by." Jerome paced nervously behind the counter, his hands twitching. "You sure about this, man? I mean, this could get out of hand real quick." Darius turned to him, his expression calm but resolute. "It won't. These guys thrive on intimidation. Once we take that from them, they've got nothing." Before Jerome could respond, the familiar jingle of the shop's bell broke the silence. The door swung open and Ethan strode in, flanked by Jake and 3 new faces Darius hadn't seen before. They were bigger, meaner looking, and clearly ready for trouble. Brandon trailed behind them, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Well, Ethan drawled, his smirk returning as he surveyed the room. "Look who decided to hang out late. You miss us, big guy?" Darius didn't move, his calm gaze locked on Ethan. "Took you long enough?" Ethan chuckled, stepping further inside as his crew spread out. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but guts only get you so far." Darius stood slowly, his imposing frame towering over the gang. "You came here to finish this, right? So let's finish it." Jake snorted, cracking his knuckles. "You're outnumbered this time, fat man. You don't stand a chance." Darius smirked, his voice low and steady. "You sure about that?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes narrowing as Darius glanced toward the back of the shop. The faint sound of footsteps reached Ethan's ears before Jack and his crew emerged from the shadows. Tyrone, Victor, and Malik followed, their expressions calm but deadly serious. The numbers had shifted, and the confidence on Ethan's face wavered. "What the hell is this?" Ethan spat, his bravado slipping. "It's called leveling the playing field," Darius said, stepping forward. "You wanted a fight? Now you've got one." For a moment the room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, with a roar, Jake lunged at Darius, fists flying. The fight erupted in an instant, chaos filling the small shop as fists and bodies collided. Darius moved like a freight train, his massive fists landing with precision and force. Jake went down first, a single crushing blow sending him sprawling into a chair. Jack and Tyrone worked in perfect sync, taking down two of the new guys with swift, brutal efficiency. Victor and Malik flanked Brandon, who raised his hands in surrender almost immediately. "I'm out," Brandon shouted, backing away toward the door. "I'm done." Ethan, meanwhile, fought like a cornered animal, swinging wildly at Darius, but Darius had seen it all before. He sidestepped each attack, countering with devastating punches that left Ethan staggering. Finally, with one last thunderous hook, Darius sent Ethan crashing to the floor. The room fell silent except for the labored breathing of the gang members who remained conscious. Darius stood over Ethan, his chest heaving as he glared down at the defeated leader. "This is your last warning," Darius said, his voice cold and firm. "You and your crew are done. If I see you around here again, you won't walk away next time." As Ethan groaned, trying to push himself up, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Darius glanced toward the window, his expression unreadable. The police were right on time. Jack stepped up beside him, wiping blood from his knuckles. "Well, that was fun." "Fun's over," Darius said, turning to the rest of the crew. "Let's clear out before the cops get here." The group moved quickly, slipping out the back door as the sirens grew louder. Darius paused for a moment, looking back at Ethan and the wreckage of the shop. It wasn't the cleanest fight, but it was done. As the team disappeared into the night, Darius knew the message had been sent loud and clear. Ethan and his gang were finished, and the neighborhood was safe. At least for now. The door creaked shut behind Ethan, sealing him and his crew inside the dimly lit barbershop. Darius stood tall by the counter, his arms crossed, exuding calm but undeniable authority. His eyes locked on Ethan's, steady and unflinching. "I don't run," Darius replied evenly, his deep voice cutting through the thick tension in the air. "But I knew you'd come back. Pride makes fools out of men like you." Ethan chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Big words for someone who's about to get flattened. You think this place can save you? Tonight, we're putting you down for good." Behind him, Jake and the younger men spread out, their weapons clinking against the tiled floor. The room felt smaller with every step they took, the air charged with aggression. Darius remained motionless, letting the seconds stretch as he studied their movements. Ethan gestured to his crew, his grin widening. "Get ready, boys, let's teach our big friend here a lesson." Darius's lips twitched into the faintest smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "This is a lesson, but not the one you're expecting." Ethan's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing in confusion. The faint sound of footsteps behind them made him pause. Before anyone could react, the back door burst open, and Jack, Tyrone, Victor, and Malik stormed in, their presence commanding. They spread out with practiced precision, each of them poised and ready. "What the hell?" Jake stammered, his confidence cracking as he backed into the counter. Ethan spun around, his bravado slipping as he realized the trap they'd walked into. "You think a few extra bodies are going to scare us?" he snarled, his grip tightening on the bat. "We've got numbers on our side." "Numbers don't mean a thing when you're outmatched," Jack replied, his voice cool as he cracked his knuckles. The tension reached its peak, the room practically vibrating with anticipation. Ethan let out a roar and lunged at Darius, swinging the bat with all his strength. Darius sidestepped effortlessly, his years of training evident in the fluidity of his movements. He countered with a swift jab to Ethan's ribs, forcing a grunt of pain as the bat slipped from his grasp. The fight erupted in an instant. Jack tackled one of the younger men wielding the crowbar, disarming him with ease before delivering a punishing uppercut. Tyrone and Victor moved as a unit, taking down two others with coordinated strikes, their experience as fighters clear in every movement. Darius focused on Ethan, who staggered backward, clutching his side. "You don't get it, do you? Darius said, advancing with slow, deliberate steps. "You don't own this place, you don't own me, and you damn sure don't own this neighborhood." Ethan let out a desperate growl and threw a wild punch, but Darius caught it mid-swing, twisting his arm and sending him to his knees with a single, calculated move. Ethan cried out, his face twisted in pain. Jake and the remaining gang members tried to rally, but they were no match for the combined skill and strength of Darius's team. Malik sent one sprawling with a hook to the jaw, while Jack delivered a punishing kick that sent another crashing into a chair. The fight was over as quickly as it began, the gang reduced to groaning, defeated bodies scattered across the shop floor. Darius released Ethan, letting him collapse onto the tiles. He stood over the gang leader, his breathing steady despite the intensity of the fight. "This is your last warning," he said, his tone cold and final. "You and your crew are done. You come back here again, and you won't be walking out." Ethan glared up at him, his defiance still flickering despite the pain. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice trembling. "This isn't over." "It is for you," Darius said, turning to Jack. "Call it in." Jack nodded, pulling out his phone and dialing. "Cops are on their way. They'll be cleaning up what's left of this mess." Ethan's face fell, realization dawning as he looked around at his unconscious and battered crew. The weight of his defeat settled on him and his head slumped forward in resignation. Darius turned to Jerome, who had cautiously peeked back into the shop once the commotion died down. "You okay?" Darius asked, his voice softer now. Jerome nodded, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "I'm good, man, but damn, that was something." Darius allowed himself a faint smile before glancing back at Ethan. The gang leader was silent now, his shoulders slumped as the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Darius stepped back, letting the moment sink in for everyone. As the police arrived and began taking statements, Darius and his team quietly slipped out the back. The job was done. The message sent. Ethan's reign of terror was over, and the neighborhood had its peace restored, thanks to a man who refused to let fear take root. The gang surged forward, their movements a chaotic mess of aggression and desperation. Ethan led the charge, his face twisted with anger as he swung a wild punch at Darius, but Darius had been waiting for this. He sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Ethan's arm mid-swing and twisting it sharply, sending him crashing to the floor with a yelp of pain. Jake followed immediately, his bat raised high. Darius ducked under the swing, delivering a brutal uppercut to Jake's ribs that sent him stumbling back, gasping for air. The chain-wielding gang member lunged next, swinging wildly. Darius caught the chain with one hand, yanked it free and with a single fluid motion, whipped it around the man's legs, pulling him to the ground. Outside, the faint sound of scuffling turned into a symphony of action as Jack, Tyrone, Victor, and Malik burst through the door. They moved with precision and discipline, each of them taking on a group of gang members with a level of skill that left no room for doubt. Jack, the largest of the group, took on 2 men at once. His massive fists flew like sledgehammers, landing with precision. One man swung a crowbar at him, but Jack ducked low and delivered a devastating punch to the man's stomach, sending him sprawling. The second man hesitated just long enough for Jack to grab him by the collar and shove him into a chair, leaving him dazed. Tyrone moved like a dancer, weaving through the chaos with lightning-fast reflexes. A gang member swung a pipe at him, but Tyrone sidestepped, grabbed the pipe mid-swing and yanked it out of the man's hands before delivering a sharp jab to his jaw. The man crumpled instantly. Victor was methodical, his strikes calculated and devastating. A younger gang member came at him with a knife, but Victor parried the attack with a quick block, twisting the man's wrist until the knife clattered to the floor. A swift knee to the stomach followed, leaving the attacker doubled over in pain. Malik was all speed and precision, dispatching one opponent with a spinning kick that sent him crashing into the wall. When another came at him from behind, Malik spun around and delivered a sharp elbow to the side of his head, dropping him like a sack of bricks. Ethan struggled to his feet, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice cracking as he stumbled back toward the door. "We'll be back, and next time—" "There won't be a next time," Darius interrupted, his voice calm but laced with finality. He stepped forward, towering over Ethan. "This is your last chance. Walk away now, and don't come back. If you do, you won't just be leaving with bruises, you'll be leaving in cuffs." Ethan hesitated, his bravado wavering as he looked around the room, His crew lay scattered, groaning on the floor, their weapons discarded. Outside, the faint sound of approaching sirens pierced the air and his face twisted in panic. "You called the cops?" he snarled, his voice trembling. Darius didn't reply immediately. He leaned in close, his voice low and steady. "This neighborhood doesn't belong to you, it never did. You wanted a fight, you got one. Now get out of here before they get here." Ethan glanced at Jake, who was barely conscious, and at the remnants of his gang now broken and defeated. With a muttered curse, he turned and limped toward the door, dragging Jake along with him. The remaining gang members scrambled to follow, their swagger replaced by a hurried retreat. As the gang disappeared into the night, the barbershop fell silent once more. Jack, Tyrone, Victor, and Malik surveyed the aftermath, their expressions calm but resolute. Jerome stepped out from behind the counter, his hands still trembling as he looked around at the battered furniture and scattered debris. "You think that's the last of them?" he asked, his voice shaky. Darius exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "It better be. But if it's not, we'll be ready." Jack clapped a hand on Darius's shoulder, grinning. "You handle yourself like the champ you are. Don't think they'll be back anytime soon." Jerome let out a nervous laugh. "Man, remind me never to get on your bad side." Darius smiled faintly but didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the door and flipped the "closed" sign, pausing to look out at the quiet street. The faint wail of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police. This time, though, it wasn't out of desperation. It was cleanup. The fight was over, for now. But as Darius looked back at the barber shop and the people who had stood by him, he knew one thing for certain. This was his community, and he'd protect it no matter what. The barber shop was a storm of chaos, a swirling mass of bodies, fists, and weapons as Darius and his team faced off against the gang. Every corner of the room was alive with the sound of shouts, grunts, and the occasional crash of furniture being overturned. The gang's confidence faltered as the tide of the fight began to turn, but Ethan's furious barks of command kept them pushing forward. Darius faced off against another attacker, his movements precise, despite the growing ache in his side from the earlier blow. The man swung at him with a crowbar, but Darius sidestepped and caught his wrist in an iron grip. With a sharp twist, he disarmed the attacker, sending the crowbar clattering to the floor before driving a hard punch into the man's stomach. The attacker doubled over, gasping for air, and Darius finished him with a controlled uppercut that left him sprawled on the ground. Nearby, Jack was an unstoppable force. One gang member tried to grab him from behind, but Jack spun around and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Another lunged at him with a knife, but Jack knocked the blade away with a swift slap to the wrist and delivered a devastating headbutt that left the man crumpled at his feet. Victor moved like a blur, his speed and precision unmatched. A gang member with a chain charged at him, swinging wildly, but Victor ducked low and swept the man's legs out from under him with a well-placed kick. Before the attacker could recover, Victor delivered a sharp strike to his temple, ensuring he stayed down. Tyrone, a towering wall of muscle, faced off against two men at once. One came at him with a broken chair leg jabbing like a makeshift spear. Tyrone deflected the strikes with ease, grabbing the weapon mid-thrust and snapping it in half over his knee. The second man tried to land a punch, but Tyrone caught the fist mid-air, squeezing until the attacker cried out in pain before throwing him into a nearby table. Malik, ever calculated, used the room to his advantage. A larger gang member swung a bat at him, but Malik ducked under the swing, grabbed the man's arm and slammed him into the counter. The bat fell from his hands and Malik delivered a series of rapid punches to the man's torso before finishing with a powerful knee to the face. Despite their numbers, the gang was losing ground. Their attacks grew more frantic, their movements less coordinated as fear seeped into their ranks. Darius's team, on the other hand, fought with a cohesion that could only come from years of experience. Ethan, still near the center of the room, watched his men fall one by one. His face was twisted with frustration and desperation as he shouted, "Get up! Keep fighting! Don't let them win!" But it was clear the gang was crumbling. Jake, bloodied and barely able to stand, attempted one last charge at Darius, his bat raised high. Darius sidestepped with ease, landing a crushing elbow to Jake's face that sent him spinning to the floor. Jake didn't get up this time. Ethan, realizing the fight was slipping out of his control, reached for a crowbar lying on the ground and swung it wildly at Darius. Darius blocked the strike with his forearm, wincing slightly at the impact, before grabbing the crowbar and yanking it out of Ethan's hands. He tossed it aside and grabbed Ethan by the collar, lifting him slightly off the ground. "It's over," Darius growled, his voice low and filled with finality. "You've lost." Ethan struggled weakly in Darius's grasp, his eyes darting around the room. His gang was defeated, some unconscious, others groaning in pain as they tried to crawl away. The sounds of sirens in the distance grew louder, the faint wail cutting through the tension. The door burst open and two uniformed officers rushed in, their weapons drawn. They paused, taking in the scene, Darius holding a battered Ethan, the gang sprawled across the shop, and Jack, Tyron, Victor, and Malik standing tall and unscathed. Darius released Ethan, who slumped to the floor in a heap and raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "It's all yours, officers," he said calmly. "They've had enough." The older officer surveyed the scene, nodding slightly as he holstered his weapon. "We got reports of a disturbance," he said dryly. "Looks like it's under control." "Yeah," Darius replied, his tone steady. "But you'll want to take these guys in. They've been causing trouble for weeks." The younger officer began cuffing Ethan, who muttered curses under his breath but didn't resist. As the police rounded up the gang, Darius turned to his team, offering a faint smile. "Good work," he said simply. Jack grinned, clapping him on the back. "Always a pleasure, big guy." The barber shop was quiet again, save for the murmur of police radios and the faint groans of the defeated gang members. Darius glanced around the room, taking in the damage: overturned chairs, broken tools, and scattered debris. It would take some time to clean up, but the fight was worth it. As the last of the gang was led out in cuffs, Jerome stepped out from behind the counter, his eyes wide. "You actually did it," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You got rid of them." Darius nodded, his expression serious. "This is our neighborhood, Jerome. They don't get to take it from us." For the first time in days, the tension lifted. The shop felt like a sanctuary again, a place where people could feel safe. And Darius knew that no matter what came next, this was a victory worth fighting for. The fight in the barber shop raged on, a relentless storm of chaos and fury. Each passing moment stretched longer as Darius and his team battled against the sheer ferocity of Ethan's gang. The room had turned into a battlefield, the walls bearing the scars of the intense confrontation. Furniture was overturned, and the air was thick with sweat, adrenaline, and the sound of fists meeting flesh. Jack held his position near the middle of the shop, his fists flying with precision, but the exhaustion was beginning to creep in. Another gang member charged at him, wielding a broken chair leg. Jack sidestepped, using the man's momentum to slam him into the counter. The man groaned as he crumpled to the floor, but another attacker immediately took his place. Jack gritted his teeth, his powerful strikes now slower but still devastating. Tyrone found himself cornered again, the two gang members circling him like predators. Their swings were less coordinated now, desperation making their movements erratic. Tyrone ducked under a wild swing, grabbing the pipe and using it to block another attack. With a growl, he twisted the pipe out of the attacker's hands and delivered a crushing blow to the man's shoulder. The second man hesitated, his confidence wavering, but Tyrone wasn't waving. He stepped forward, driving a knee into the man's stomach, sending him sprawling onto the floor. Victor continued to move like a blur, his speed and agility keeping his attackers off balance. As another gang member lunged at him with a bat, Victor ducked low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The attacker hit the ground hard, but a second gang member immediately pressed forward, swinging a heavy wrench. Victor deflected the blow with his forearm, wincing slightly, and countered with a spinning elbow strike that connected with the man's jaw. The gang member staggered backward, his weapon clattering to the ground. Malik was locked in a brutal struggle with a massive opponent. The man's sheer size and strength forced Malik onto the defensive, but Malik's experience and technique kept him in the fight. The attacker swung wildly, his fists crashing into the wall as Malik dodged at the last second. Malik seized the opportunity, landing a rapid series of punches to the man's ribs before driving a knee into his side. The larger man roared in frustration, but Malik ducked under his next swing and used the chain he'd grabbed earlier to pull the attacker off balance, sending him crashing to the ground. In the center of the room, Darius and Ethan's fight had reached a boiling point. Ethan's knife gleamed as he slashed at Darius with reckless abandon. Each strike was wild and fueled by rage, but Darius remained calm, his years of training guiding his every movement. He dodged left, deflected a strike with his forearm, and countered with a jab to Ethan's ribs. The blow forced Ethan to stumble, but his fury only seemed to grow. "You think you've won?" Ethan snarled, his voice hoarse as he lunged again. "You're nothing, Cole. Nothing. Darius sidestepped the attack, catching Ethan's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the floor and Ethan let out a howl of pain. Darius didn't let go, pulling Ethan closer and landing a devastating right hook to his jaw. Ethan staggered back, his knees wobbling as he struggled to stay upright. Despite their leader's faltering stance, the remaining gang members pushed forward, their desperation driving them into reckless attacks. Darius's team, though weary, held their ground. Jack landed a brutal uppercut that sent his opponent sprawling into the wall. Tyrone slammed another attacker onto the floor with a thunderous crash. Victor, moving with precision, disarmed an attacker and used the man's own weapon against him. Malik, his movements fluid and efficient, delivered a knockout blow to the final gang member in his path. The tide of the fight had turned. Ethan, bloodied and barely able to stand, looked around at his fallen crew. His confidence evaporated, replaced by fear and disbelief. He took a shaky step back, his hands raised as if to ward off another blow. "It's over," Darius said, his voice steady and commanding. He took a step forward, his imposing frame casting a shadow over Ethan. "You don't run this place anymore." Ethan glared at him, his face twisted with anger, but he didn't respond. The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan's eyes darted toward the door, panic flickering across his face. The door burst open as two police officers stormed in, their weapons drawn. They froze for a moment, taking in the scene. The battered gang members sprawled across the floor, Darius and his team standing tall despite their exhaustion. The two of them started up from their stretches, which came later than expected. "You called it in?" one officer asked, his gaze shifting to Darius. Darius nodded, his expression calm. "They came looking for trouble. We made sure they found it." The officers began cuffing the gang members, dragging them out one by one. Ethan struggled weakly as they restrained him, shouting curses and threats that fell on deaf ears. As the last of the gang was escorted out, the officers paused, looking at Darius. "Looks like you've handled things here," the older officer said, a hint of respect in his voice. "But next time, call us before it gets this bad." Darius nodded, but his expression didn't change. "I did what I had to do." As the police cars pulled away, the barbershop fell silent once more. Darius looked around at the damage, the overturned chairs, the broken glass, the bloodstains on the floor, and let out a slow breath. Jerome stepped forward, his face a mix of relief and awe. "You did it, Darius. You stopped them." Darius nodded, his gaze distant. "For now." The shop was quiet, but the air was filled with a sense of triumph. The fight was over, and the message was clear. The neighborhood wouldn't bow to fear or intimidation, not as long as people like Darius were there to stand against it. The remaining gang members faltered, their earlier confidence shattered as they saw their leader pinned against the counter by Darius. The chaotic noise of the barbershop began to subside, replaced by the labored breathing of the fighters and the faint sound of sirens growing closer. Ethan struggled against Darius's grip, but it was futile. Darius's strength and resolve were unyielding. Jack and Tyrone stood back to back, surveying the room as they caught their breath. Around them, the gang members who were still conscious were slumped against walls or sprawled on the floor, too battered to continue the fight. Jack wiped the blood from the cut on his brow, his chest heaving as he looked at Tyrone. "Looks like that's the last of them," Jack muttered, his voice tinged with exhaustion but triumphant. "Yeah," Tyrone replied, his tone steady despite the toll of the fight. "They're done." Victor and Malik regrouped near the door, their movements fluid despite the bruises and cuts they'd accumulated. Victor tossed the chain he'd taken from an attacker onto the floor, shaking his head with a faint smirk. "Amateurs," he said, his voice low but confident. "All numbers, no skill." Malik glanced toward Darius, his eyes narrowing as he saw Ethan still struggling. "Darius has it handled," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Let's make sure none of these idiots try anything else." The boxers moved systematically, ensuring the remaining gang members were too incapacitated to pose a threat. One by one they were stripped of their weapons, their bruised and battered forms left sprawled in defeated heaps across the room. The barbershop, once a storm of chaos, was now eerily still. Ethan's voice broke the silence, his tone a mix of fury and desperation. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, his words dripping with venom. "You might have won tonight, but you can't stop us. There's more where we came from." Darius leaned in closer, his grip tightening as he pressed Ethan harder against the counter. His voice was calm, cold, and unwavering. "You're done, Ethan. You don't run this neighborhood anymore. And if you or your crew ever think about coming back, I'll make sure this time you don't walk away." Ethan glared at him, but the defiance in his eyes was dimming. The fight had left him bruised and broken, his ego crushed under the weight of his defeat. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. The sound of sirens outside grew louder, the flashing lights of police cars illuminating the street as they pulled up in front of the shop. The gang members who were still conscious shifted uncomfortably, their bravado completely gone. The officers stormed in, their weapons drawn as they assessed the scene. "Everyone down," one of the officers shouted, his voice cutting through the tense air. Darius slowly released Ethan, raising his hands in a gesture of compliance. Ethan collapsed onto the floor, clutching his injured arm and glaring up at Darius with a mix of hatred and fear. The officers moved quickly, handcuffing the gang members and securing the scene. One of the officers, a grizzled veteran with a stern expression, approached Darius. "You Cole?" he asked, glancing at the towering man who still seemed to command the room despite the chaos. "Yeah," Darius replied, his voice steady but exhausted. The officer nodded, looking around at the battered gang members. "Looks like you handled things here. Care to explain what happened?" Darius gestured to Ethan, who was being cuffed by another officer. "They came here looking for trouble. We made sure they found it." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed, but keeping his expression neutral. "Well, we'll take it from here. You might have saved us a lot of work tonight." As the officers led Ethan and his gang out of the barber shop, the tension in the room finally began to lift. The patrons who had been watching from the sidelines started to stir, their faces a mix of awe and gratitude. Jerome stepped forward, his hand still trembling slightly as he looked at Darius. "You did it, man," Jerome said, his voice thick with emotion. "You stopped them." Darius nodded, his expression softening as he looked around the shop. The place was a mess, chairs overturned, glass shattered, and blood stains marking the floor, but it was still standing. More importantly, the neighborhood was safe again. Jack clapped a hand on Darius's shoulder, his grin breaking through the exhaustion. "Hell of a fight, big man. You've still got it." Tyrone, Victor, and Malik joined them, their camaraderie clear as they exchanged nods of respect. The team had come together to defend what mattered, and they'd succeeded. As the last of the police cars pulled away, taking Ethan and his crew with them, Darius turned to Jerome. "It's over," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of the night. Jerome smiled faintly, relief washing over him. "Yeah, thanks to you." Darius glanced out the window, the quiet streets bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. The fight had been brutal, but it was worth it. The neighborhood wouldn't have to live in fear anymore. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit his face, and for the first time in weeks, Darius allowed himself to breathe freely. The battle was over, but the message was clear. This was their home, and no one would take it from them. The defeated gang members, slumped and nursing their injuries, watched as Ethan was hauled to his feet. His bravado had vanished, replaced by the weight of his own failure. The scene inside the barber shop spoke volumes, a battlefield won by those who refused to let fear dictate their lives. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, drawing the attention of onlookers who gathered in hushed clusters to witness the aftermath. Darius stood tall in the center of the room, his fists unclenched now, but his imposing presence still commanding the space. His sharp eyes swept over the scene, taking in the battered furniture, the discarded weapons, and the bloodied faces of Ethan's crew. Despite the chaos, there was a sense of closure hanging in the air. The fight was over, and the neighborhood had been defended. The lead officer, a man with a gruff demeanor and a hardened gaze, turned to Darius after shoving Ethan toward the door. "You've made quite the mess here," he said, his voice flat, but edged with grudging respect. "But I'd be lying if I said we weren't grateful. These guys have been a thorn in our side for months." Darius's voice was calm but firm. "We didn't do this for you. We did this because the people here deserve better. They deserve to feel safe." The officer nodded, glancing around at the disheveled shop. "Understood. But next time, call us before it gets to this point." Jack, standing nearby with his arms crossed, let out a low chuckle. "We did call, just took you a little longer than expected to show up." The officer shot Jack a look but didn't argue. Instead, he motioned to the other officers who were busy cuffing the remaining gang members and escorting them outside. "Let's get this place cleared out," he barked, "and I want statements from everyone before we leave." As the officers worked, Jerome stepped into the center of the room, his eyes wide as he took in the damage. The barber shop, his sanctuary, had been turned upside down, but his expression shifted to one of relief as he looked at Darius. "You did it," Jerome said quietly, his voice heavy with gratitude. "You really did it." Darius turned to him, his expression softening for the first time that night. "We did it," he corrected. "This place, this neighborhood, it doesn't belong to people like Ethan, it belongs to us." Victor walked over, wiping sweat from his brow and nodding toward the officers escorting the gang outside. "They're done. Whatever hold they thought they had on this place is gone." Malik chimed in, leaning against a chair that was miraculously still upright. "And if they ever think about coming back, they'll remember tonight." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of the victory sinking in. It wasn't just about the fight, it was about reclaiming what mattered, about standing up for a community that deserved better. Ethan, now being dragged out the door, turned his head for one last glare at Darius. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice hoarse and weak. "You hear me, Cole? You'll regret this." Darius didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his voice low but cutting through the noise like steel. "It is over. You just don't realize it yet." The officer escorting Ethan shoved him forward, muttering, "Keep moving," as Ethan stumbled onto the sidewalk. The other gang members followed, their heads down and their fight drained. As the last of the officers exited, the barber shop began to quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the faint hum of the street outside seeped through the cracked windows. The patrons who had remained throughout the chaos began to stir, exchanging quiet words of disbelief and admiration. Jerome looked around the shop, his gaze landing on the overturned chairs and scattered clippers. "Place is a mess," he said, shaking his head, but his voice carried a note of pride. "But we're still standing." Darius offered him a faint smile. "It's just a place. What matters is that the people here know they don't have to live in fear anymore." Jack stepped forward, clapping Darius on the shoulder. "You've still got it, big man. Same guy I remember from back in the day." Darius chuckled softly. "Just a little older, that's all." The group began to tidy the shop, setting chairs upright and gathering the debris left from the fight. The sense of camaraderie was palpable, a bond forged in the heat of battle and strengthened by the shared goal of protecting their home. As the night stretched on, the barber shop returned to a semblance of normalcy, the sirens faded into the distance, and the crowd outside began to disperse. Darius stood by the door, looking out at the quiet street, the weight of the night's events settling in. "You're a hero, you know," Jerome said, stepping beside him. Darius shook his head, his gaze steady. "I'm just a man doing what needed to be done." Jerome smiled faintly. "Well, this neighborhood owes you." Darius didn't reply immediately. He watched the street for a moment longer before turning back to Jerome. "They don't owe me anything. Just take care of this place. Make sure it stays what it's always been, a safe space for people to come together." With that, he stepped outside, the cool night air washing over him as he walked down the quiet street. The fight was over, but the message was clear. The neighborhood belonged to the people who called it home, and no one was going to take that away from them again. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the barber shop, casting warm rays across the now restored space. Despite the signs of the previous night's battle, cracked mirrors, scuffed floors, and a lingering tension in the air, the shop felt alive. It wasn't just a place to cut hair, it was a symbol of resilience, of a neighborhood standing tall in the face of adversity. Jack tossed the last of the broken furniture onto the curb and dusted his hands off. "Well, that's about as good as it's going to get," he said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Victor leaned against the counter, his arms crossed as he surveyed the shop. "Yeah, it does. They came in here thinking they could own this place. Now they know they don't." Malik wiped his brow with a towel, a small grin tugging at his lips. "We turned this shop into a ring, and they didn't last a single round." Darius stood near the door, his gaze fixed on the street outside as he let their words wash over him. He didn't need to respond. The results spoke for themselves. The gang had been broken, their grip on the neighborhood shattered, and their threats silenced. But this wasn't just about the fight. It was about something much bigger. It was about proving that unity and determination could stand against even the toughest challenges. The door jingled softly as it swung open, revealing more familiar faces from the neighborhood. People trickled in, their steps hesitant but their expressions hopeful. An older man with a cane peered around, his eyes widening at the sight of the shop. "So it's true," he murmured, his voice cracking slightly. You stood up to them." Jerome, standing behind the counter, smiled faintly and gestured toward Darius and his team. "They didn't just stand up to them, they took them down. These guys made sure this place stays ours." The older man shuffled forward, his hand trembling as he extended it toward Darius. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "You don't know how much this means to all of us." Darius shook his hand firmly, his expression calm but kind. "It wasn't just me," he said, motioning to Jack, Victor, Malik, and Tyrone. "It was all of us. And it's not just about this shop, it's about the neighborhood." A group of teenagers entered next, carrying new chairs they'd pooled their money to buy from a local store. "We figured you might need these," one of them said shyly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know, to replace the broken ones." Jerome's eyes softened as he watched them set up the chairs. "You kids didn't have to do that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. One of the teenagers shrugged. "You've always let us hang out here, figured it was the least we could do." The shop began to buzz with quiet energy as more people joined in, helping to rearrange the furniture, scrub the floors, and clean the windows. A young woman brought in a fresh pot of coffee, while an older couple set up a plate of pastries on the counter. The atmosphere shifted from one of fear and tension to one of community and hope. Jerome leaned back against the counter, watching as his shop came back to life with the help of those it had always served. "Guess I was wrong," he said softly, glancing at Darius. "This place doesn't just belong to me, it belongs to everyone." Darius smiled faintly, his gaze shifting toward the teenagers laughing as they dusted off the shelves. "That's why it's worth fighting for," he replied, "because it's not about the walls or the chairs, it's about the people." As the cleanup wound down, the sun climbed higher, casting its golden light across the street. The barbershop wasn't perfect. There were still scars from the fight, marks on the floor and cracks in the mirrors, but it was standing, and more importantly, it was stronger than ever. Jerome clapped a hand on Darius's shoulder as they stood in the doorway, looking out at the quiet street. "You know," Jerome began, a small grin breaking through his tired expression, "if you ever get tired of whatever you're doing, you've got a spot here. I think you'd make a hell of a barber." Darius let out a deep chuckle, shaking his head. "I think I'll stick to what I know, but I'll always be around if you need me." Jerome nodded, his grin softening into something more genuine. "I know, and I'll hold you to that." As Darius stepped outside, the cool morning air greeted him, carrying with it the sounds of a waking neighborhood. He paused for a moment, glancing back at the barber shop. Inside, he could see Jerome and the others laughing as they finished setting up, the shop glowing with new life. He smiled to himself, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. The fight was over, but the message had been sent loud and clear. This neighborhood belonged to its people, and as long as they stood together, no one could take that away. The street glowed in the warm hues of the setting sun, bustling with a newfound energy. The barber shop, now revitalized, stood as a beacon of resilience, its fresh paint and polished glass reflecting the light. Neighbors lingered, their laughter and chatter weaving together a melody of unity and hope. Darius leaned against the doorframe, his broad silhouette framed by the vibrant activity outside. He crossed his arms, surveying the scene with a quiet pride. People who once walked the block with their heads down now moved with confidence. Children played on the sidewalk, their laughter ringing out, unburdened by fear. This wasn't just about fixing a shop, it was about restoring something deeper: trust, safety, and community. Jerome stepped out of the shop, his hands on his hips as he took in the sight. "Well," he said, letting out a low whistle, "this is something else. Never thought I'd see this place buzzing like this?" Darius smiled faintly. "People needed this," he replied. "Something to remind them what this neighborhood is really about." Jerome nodded, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "I guess you were right all along. It's not just about the shop, it's the people." A group of teenagers jogged past, their arms laden with brushes and rollers. One of them waved toward Darius and Jerome. "We're almost done with the mural out back," he shouted, his voice brimming with excitement. Jerome raised an eyebrow. "Mural?" Darius smirked. "Guess you'll have to check it out." Curious, the two men walked around to the alley behind the shop. A crowd had gathered, admiring the work of the young artists. The mural was bold and vibrant, a depiction of strength and unity. At the center was a powerful image of two hands clasped together, surrounded by colorful symbols of the neighborhood: barber tools, basketballs, flowers, and the barbershop itself. Underneath, in bold letters, were the words, "Together we stand, night and day, night and day, night and night, and night and night." Underneath, in bold letters, were the words, "Together we stand." Jerome's jaw dropped. "They did this?" he asked, his voice tinged with awe. "Yeah," Darius said, his tone warm. "Looks like they've been paying attention. This is their way of saying thanks." Jerome stared at the mural for a long moment before finally nodding. "It's perfect," he said softly. The crowd in the alley began to disperse as the day wound down, the neighbors heading home with satisfied smiles. Back at the shop, Jack, Victor, Tyrone and Malik were wrapping up their work, exchanging fist bumps and teasing banter about who had worked the hardest. Malik leaned against the counter, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, looks like our job here is done," he said, grinning. "This place is better than new." Jack clapped Darius on the back. "You pulled it off, Cole. Not bad for a guy who's supposed to be retired." Darius chuckled. "Retirement's overrated." Victor smirked. "Yeah, well, if you ever decide to open a boxing gym, let us know. I'm pretty sure you've got half the neighborhood ready to sign up." Tyrone nodded. "You've got that right. They've seen what you can do." Jerome stepped forward, extending a hand toward the group. "I don't know how to thank you guys," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "What you did here, it's more than I could have ever asked for." Jack shook his hand firmly. "You don't have to thank us. This is what we do." The team gathered their things, preparing to leave, but the bond they'd formed felt like it would remain unbroken. As the group stepped outside, the last rays of sunlight cast a golden glow over the street. A young girl ran up to Darius, clutching a piece of paper in her small hands. "Mr. Darius!" she called, her face lit with excitement. She held up a drawing of the barbershop, the mural prominently displayed on the wall. "I drew this for you." Darius knelt to take the drawing, his rough hands handling it delicately. "This is amazing," he said, a genuine smile breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "Thank you." The girl beamed. "Are you going to stay here forever?" she asked, her voice full of innocence. Darius chuckled softly, glancing at the shop and then back at her. "I'll always be around when you need me," he said. "But you've got a lot of people here who'll look out for you too." As the girl ran back to her mother, Darius stood and looked around at the neighborhood. The barber shop gleamed, standing taller than ever, a testament to what they had all fought for. This wasn't just a victory, it was a beginning. Jerome stood beside him, his arms crossed as he took it all in. "You know," he said quietly, "you're not just part of this neighborhood anymore, Darius. You're part of the family." Darius gave him a sidelong glance, his smile faint but full of meaning. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The two men stood there for a while longer, watching as the streetlights flickered on and the neighborhood settled into a peaceful evening. For the first time in a long time, it felt like home, and that, Darius thought, was worth every fight. As the neighborhood settled into a quieter rhythm, the barbershop stood as a symbol of resilience and unity. Darius didn't need applause or recognition. The sight of a community coming together to rebuild and reclaim what mattered was more than enough. As the lights inside the shop dimmed, casting a soft glow onto the quiet street, Darius leaned back in one of the freshly repaired chairs, his reflection in the mirror faint but steady. The night was peaceful, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the block felt safe. Tomorrow life would return to normal, or as normal as it could be, but tonight he allowed himself to rest, his mind at ease knowing the neighborhood was stronger than before. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the quiet streets greeted him like an old friend. The barber shop stood behind him, its glow a beacon of hope for the people who called this place home. Darius walked slowly, his shoulders relaxed despite the faint ache in his muscles. The fight had left its mark, but so had the victory. Before turning the corner, he glanced back one last time, his faint smile catching the streetlight. He didn't need to stay in the spotlight. The neighborhood would carry forward, stronger, united, and ready to face whatever came next. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In the meantime, I've handpicked 2 more stories that I think you'll love. Have a great day.